Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So before I begin today, I just want to thank everyone who has subscribed to my channel. I'm about to hit the 20,000 subscriber mark. I just need another 180 subscribers, so that's really something. But today, I'm going to talk about why you are most probably, if you're subscribed to my channel anyways, you are most probably in some way disgusted by quote-unquote progressive storytelling and progressive entertainment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by looking at a study. It came out a couple of years ago. I think it was 2019. I'll link one of the articles about it in the description so you can read all about it. But the article basically talks about this scientific experiment that was conducted by first a political scientist who then employed a neuroscientist to look at people's brain scans while showing them different pictures of things to see if they could find a correlation between brain activity and whether or not they were conservative or liberal. And to their surprise, they actually found there was a great correlation between those things. Now, there were some studies before this about the exact same subject that employed different methods, but they all seem to show the same thing, that there is a correlation between brain activity and whether or not you're a conservative or a liberal. And they found that even though they showed them a vast array of different kinds of pictures, nice pictures and violent pictures and soothing pictures, it was the pictures of disgusting things that they showed them that gave them the indication of whether or not they were liberal or conservative. And they found that after they showed them these pictures and did the brain scans, they gave them a short political test, which had some, as they say, hot button issue questions on it, saying, are you in favor of this or are you in favor of that? And so this is how they found out whether they were conservative or liberal. And they would match them to the brain scans, and 95% of the time, they could figure out from the brain scans by looking at what was happening within the brain when these disgusting pictures were put in front of them, whether or not they were liberal or conservative. And the point being that this experiment shows, and other ones before it, that yes, if you are shown a picture of something disturbing, of something disgusting, or sometimes within the other experiments they used smells, if you have a disgust reaction to the disgusting thing, then you're most likely, 95% likely, to be a conservative. And if you don't have a disgust reaction to a disgusting thing, then you're 95% most likely going to be liberal. Now, first of all, I'll have to say, I don't know what their definition of liberal is. And for myself, I'm not concentrating on whether a person is liberal or not. I'm concentrating on whether a person is far left, quote unquote, progressive. This is what I focus on. So when I talk about this, I'm going to talk about people in the far left category. Now, I want to go deep into the weeds of this before I start talking about the storytelling aspect of this, which will come at the end of this video, but I don't think that will make sense skipping forward to that point unless we discuss these other things before. So the first point I want to pull out of this is the fact that, at the very least in the article that I'm going to post, and really in several other articles, they tried to spin it as if it's a good thing for liberals and for quote-unquote progressive people. Most of these outlets that covered this were liberal-leaning papers or outlets, and I'll put one of those liberal outlets again in the description. But they seemed a little bit shocked by this, and at the same time, they thought it was fascinating, as if this proved something which had never been even considered before. And honestly, I find that quite laughable, because I would say this exact thing was proved philosophically probably about 2,400 years ago, and I would say logically about the same time, about 2,400 years ago as well. But the thing is that today, proving things philosophically and logically doesn't cut any ice with a lot of people. You need to give them science in order to show them something as if it's true, and that's the only kind of truth. By the way, that's called scientism. But anyways. And it was funny, in the article that I'm going to post in the description, it was from The Atlantic, and at the end of it, they talk about Aristotle and say things like, oh, if Aristotle only knew these things back then. I'm sorry, but he did know these things, philosophically and logically. He didn't need to go to, as the saying goes, to the horse's mouth to find these things out. He already knew them. But to talk about the experiment itself. Now, the kind of pictures that they showed these people, that is to say, these disgusting pictures, were things that would normally invoke a disgust reaction within a human being. Things like mutilated animals, or rotten meat with maggots in it. I think the smell one employed a smell of vomit, things like that. things that would invoke a natural reaction to these things within a human being, a natural reaction of disgust. And I just want to put in a little personal thing here. I worked on farms for a while when I was younger. Most of them were just normal farms that had a wide variety of things. Some were ranches, some were pig farms. There are some certain things that you will encounter that will make you disgusted and sick. It doesn't matter if you say to yourself, I don't know what this is. What is that smell? Or I can put up with this. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't affect me. Your body is going to tell you otherwise. There is a natural disgust reaction, and it means something. And if you try to override it with your mind, your body will tell you otherwise. And I know this from experience. But my point in saying that is the fact that when a person does not have a disgust reaction to a disgusting thing, it's not normal. And they do go into this a little bit in some of the articles. They talk about the fact that this disgust reaction is in some way triggered by a response of fight or flight, that is to say, to keep yourself alive. You recognize something is not right here, and this revulsion and disgust, which is a natural thing which happens to your body, is your body's way, and sometimes your mind's way, of telling you, get away from this thing if you want to have a better chance of surviving. And again, I go through all that to highlight the very important, really key fact that what is the most basic thing that a human being needs to do? Well, the most basic thing that you need to do to be a human being is to survive. And if this is part of your survival instinct and you're ignoring it, whether it's because you've trained yourself to do so or because it's something that you were born with, this is not normal. Because it is quite simply diminishing your ability and your chance to do the most basic thing, which is survive. And this is extremely important because it's one of the underlying important factors in your quote-unquote progressive ideology. One of the things that they're trying always to teach is that there is no such thing as normal. So, just to back that up with some evidence, I usually deal with comic books, and that's where I get a lot of my information from because it's a good microcosm of the entertainment industry itself. And I concentrate on the biggest comic producer, which is Marvel, and the person who was in control of Marvel when this entire quote-unquote progressive agenda really took hold. And the person that was there for the longest time and in the most control was a woman named Sana Amanat. She was basically the number 2, but really in operational control of Marvel Comics from about 2012 to, I'd say, 2020. She was there spearheading the all-new, all-different progressive storytelling. She was the director of content and character development. She is the one under whose watch were created all of these characters that you're seeing in the movies and the television shows. Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel, Kate Bishop, Hawkeye, America Chavez, etc., etc. And one of her most proud moments, and I say that because she has pinned this to the top of her Twitter site since I think it was 2016. She was introducing then sitting president, I think it was Barack Obama, at the White House, and I'll link one of those videos in the description in order for you to see that actual exchange if you want to see it. But the point is, she was introducing Barack Obama, and first of all, she was talking about the comics made at Marvel Comics again, which she was pretty much in operational control of. And in that video, she talks about how there is no normal. She begins by talking about how Kamala Khan, her creation, or the creation based on her really, was first seeking to be quote-unquote normal. She uses finger quotes when she uses the word normal. And then she comes to the point where she says, being normal is being different. And basically she says there is no such thing as normal. And also I should say there is a quote that she gives which will be relevant later on in what I am discussing. She says, the images we share and the stories we tell impact the perceptions of ourselves and the perceptions of others. And this perception that she wants to talk about is the fact that different is normal, or to put it another way, there is no such thing as normal. And this is one of the underlying currents of thought within all of this quote-unquote progressive entertainment. Now, here's where I get into the weeds. Why is it a underlying current of thought within progressive entertainment? Well, it's because these people are quote-unquote progressives. That's how they refer to themselves. And the question becomes again, what are they progressing towards? Well, they're progressing towards, supposedly, some kind of social utopia. They're utopian-minded people, and the kind of utopia that they want to bring about is a social utopia. This is, of course, why they gravitate towards political movements that are socialist in nature. But the whole point of this social movement, this social idealism, this idea of building a social utopia that has been plaguing our planet for the last, well, at least 150 years in its current iteration, is the idea that, no, we're not trying to build a utopia that men can live in perfectly. They want to build men that can live in a social utopia. This is a crucial difference that most people do not pick up on. And it is that building of men with social forces in order for them to fit into a utopia that is what they're trying to do at its heart. And the only way that they can believe that they can do that is if there is no such thing as a fixed human nature. I'm always going on about this. This is one of the inception points of their entire ideology. They believe there is no such thing as a fixed human nature. By the way, Western civilization, since its inception, believed there was such a thing as a fixed human nature. And by the way, it's wholly ridiculous to believe otherwise. It's just like saying there is no such thing as truth. I'm sorry, you're contradicting yourself when you say that, because if you're saying there's no such thing as truth, you're claiming that as if it were true, and therefore it is truth, and therefore you have just disproven your own statement. The same thing happens when someone says there is no such thing as a fixed human nature. If there is no such thing as a fixed human nature, then that's the fixed human nature of a human being. Therefore, you have just proven yourself wrong. This is why these people, if you get them to that point, usually regress into something like Nietzschean dynamism, where everything is basically a whirlwind of flux that just swirls around the individual, and that's all there is. And yes, Nietzsche himself even admitted this is not a rational concept. He didn't care. But two things to pull out of that. Number one, why do they believe there is no such thing as a fixed human nature? Why? Because if there was, then you would have to work around that in order to create your social utopia. But they believe that this social utopia is possible by being able to change mankind into whatever they want. And you can't do that if there is any fixed point at all. So, in believing there is a utopia that can be here on Earth and men can fit into it, they have to believe there is no such thing as fixed human nature. And of course, as I said, this is an irrational concept. And that brings me to the point of rationality itself. You see, rationality and logic, which is what I'm always talking about, these things are based upon an idea that there is a norm and that we can know what that norm is within reality. This is the process of rationality itself, if it works correctly. You are looking at the world around you and you're pulling out patterns and saying, this is normal, let's see where I can go from there. And this is the exact thing that underlies logic. Logic is taking the rules of reason and applying them to reason itself. And in doing that, you can make statements that are unequivocal according to reality. Statements like, a thing is what it is. These are statements of a norm. They're saying this is normal. And when discussing those norms, you try to break them down to their most fundamental parts. That is to say, you want to go back to the essence of the thing. And the essence of the thing will never change. And that's one of the core elements. If we look at the essence of a human being, which is their human nature, you will say that it doesn't matter when this person was born, what color your skin is, it doesn't matter who you were born to, where you were born, you all have the same human nature. There is an essence of a thing which is a human being that exists within every human being. If it wasn't there, you would be something other than a human being. And I'm going this far down into the weeds for a very specific purpose. Why? Because this is where beauty exists. It exists independent of human beings, and it is part, according to Western civilization, of the essence of things. What is, that is to say, what exists, is true, and what is true is also beautiful. And beauty is something that exists, which is contrary to what is disgusting. It is the norm, the normal principle of what is the opposite of what is disgusting. So let's take all of what I've just discussed and apply it to this idea and this concept of disgust. So within the political ideology of these quote-unquote progressive people is build a social utopia. In order to do that, they have to believe that there is no such thing as human nature. In so believing there is no such thing as a human nature, they believe there is no such thing as normal. In believing there is no such thing as normal, they believe that there is no such thing as something that should normally disgust you. Therefore, they try to present disgusting things as if they were normal. This, by the way, is why when you have these socialist-minded people, you often see them, if they're left unchecked, starting to conduct the most horrific experiments, or at the very least social experiments, upon human beings. They want to see how far from quote-unquote normal they can get in order to see how far they can push a human being or human culture or human society in the direction they want it to go. And here's where they employ a very neat trick. It is the trick that I talked about in my last video. They actually try to control everyone and make sure that they don't question this no such thing as normal idea by calling them an ist or a phobe of one kind or another. And this all plays into their shaming mechanism, which they use to control society. That is to say, to control their experiment. And if I remember correctly, you can go back to, I think, about 1913 and find documentation of them stating this is exactly how you need to control people. And the funny thing is that ists and phobes are very different things. I would say you're talking about if you're an ist, you have ist at the end of what you're calling someone. It is usually you're going back to what is an intermediate principle, not the actual principle of the thing. Therefore, you're being short-sighted. But I don't want to concentrate on that because I can go back beyond what an ist is, and I can support my ideas by things which are fundamental principles of reality. So the idea of calling me an ist in any way doesn't make any impact on me whatsoever. And it seems to be making less and less impact upon most people. But it's the phobe part. That part still has some impact, but it shouldn't. And it's connected to this idea of disgust, and here's why. Their basic principle is that fear in itself is something bad. And so if you're basing your motivations on fear, you're obviously doing something wrong. That's the basis of their shaming mechanism. But that is not the way fear is viewed throughout Western civilization. It's only the way that they view fear, and it can only be that way if it's supported by their ideology. Now, there is something very close to this within Western civilization itself. It would be Stoicism. Stoicism did take some emotions and say, those are wholly bad, and you should never experience those emotions at all. But then Christianity came along and said, no, that's not the case. All emotions are things which can be either good or bad, and it depends on the will behind them. Now, this whole concept comes from Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century AD. He was born a Roman of a pagan Roman father and a Christian Roman mother, and he followed his father's footsteps, and he eventually became a Stoic, and he was a Stoic for quite some time. And he was, I think it was a lawyer at the time, so he began to argue and to look at the more fundamental points of argumentation and whatnot. But he eventually converted to be a Christian, and when he did that, he then began to write treatises which compared the two, showing why Stoicism just doesn't work. Now, why should this concern you at all? Why? Because in those works, Augustine also created the notion of will that we still use today. And whenever you say the word will, or shall, or won't, or anything that is dependent upon that word of will, you're using the concept that was flushed out by Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century AD. Prior to that, the idea of will itself was an ancient idea of the Romans and the Greeks, and it was combined with a whole bunch of different ideas like destiny and fate and chance and Moira and your thumos and your doom and what the gods wanted for you, all of these kinds of things. But Augustine of Hippo came along and said, no, it's based upon you and your choices, what you direct yourself towards. That's what he saw the will as. So yes, what this man thought and what he taught is immensely impactful on all of Western civilization. He's one of the key intellectual figures within Western civilization, and even the language that you use today and the concepts that you use to understand the world around you. Now, for him, of course, it all goes back to will, as I said. He argues that, yes, if you have an emotion like fear, it can be good, it can be bad. It depends upon where your will is directing you. That is to say, are you directed towards the good? Are you directed towards reality? Are you directed towards truth? Or are you directed away from those things? And that's how you determine whether you have a good will or not. And he defined fear as a volition of consent that moves you away from what you do not wish to happen. And of course, in addition to this plays into a rational principle. This is the idea of most of Western civilization that, yes, human beings, if they are to live up to the principles whereby they naturally should exist, they exist in a state where their reason is in control and their passions, which would include your emotions, are the servant of the reason. Now, by the way, that has been flipped on its head since, I'd say probably about Descartes, but mostly by Hobbes, Locke, and Hume. They would say, yes, we are rational, but rationality is the servant of the passions and the emotions, and this is where these people, these quote-unquote progressive people, would come from as well. They think, no, it's all about the passions are in control. No, the original concept upon which all of Western civilization stands is a concept where naturally your reason should be in control and your passions should be the servant. And so, yes, there can be a good fear. Why? Because you're looking at this thing. You're having a disgust reaction to it. It is horrifying you. It is making you disgusted. You don't want to go in that direction because you know pain waits for you if you go in that direction. Therefore, you turn away from it. This is how he defines fear. And while it's not rational itself, it certainly can be directed by the reason in order to be something good. Again, it's directed by you looking at something and saying, that's wrong. That's something that's disgusting. It disgusts me. It horrifies me because I know if I go in that direction, it's going to be bad for me. Therefore, I am backing away from this thing. That is what fear is. And that's the thing. Whenever these quote-unquote progressive people call you an hysterophobe and you back off saying, no, I don't want to be called that, you're playing straight into their hands because you're accepting their underlying idea that fear itself must always be bad. I don't care. They can call me a phobe of any kind they want. I don't care. Why? Because I believe, as Western civilization believes, that yes, there is such a thing as a good fear. I don't want that to happen. I certainly don't want that to happen to me. I am backing away from this thing. Why? Because reality tells me that's not normal. Reality tells me that's disgusting. Why? I want to survive. It is something ingrained within me to move away from that thing so that I can A, survive and B, flourish. But the point of what these quote-unquote progressive people do is to try to teach you that being afraid of anything is wrong. Why? Because, of course, that fear of something is based upon primarily a feeling of horror and disgust at this thing. Therefore, if you're not afraid, it removes that horror and disgust from you, and so they get to, quote-unquote, normalize things which are horrific and disgusting. Then, of course, they can use that normalization to pound and shape you and human beings as a society into what they want in order to, again, fit them into their social utopia. And storytelling is one of the main ways that they do this. Remember that quote that I gave a little while ago from Sana Amanat, where she said, "The images we share and the stories we tell impact the perceptions of ourselves and the perceptions of others." What's she talking about? Well, in the context of different is normal, there is no normal, she's trying to say we need to share these images of things which are horrific and disgusting so that not only you can perceive them as being good, but others can perceive them as being, if not good, at the very least normal. At the very least, something that can exist in front of you without you drawing back in horror and disgust. Now, this video is getting very long, and I still haven't gotten into the storytelling part of this. So if you want some evidence of those things that I just talked about, you can go back to a book, which I think is out of print right now. It originally came out in 1989. It's called After the Ball. And it sets out the entire thing that I have just discussed. It sets out everything according to an advertising executive way of making people accept what they would normally see, certainly in 1989, as being disgusting and horrific. And it goes through all of the things that have become now tropes of your progressive movement. Always portray yourself as a victim. Shame and demoralize the people who are opposed to you. Make them look like crazy people. Use propaganda, and they use that word specifically. And most of all, convince people not that these things which are not normal are good, but that they're just another thing. So let's finally bring this down to storytelling and why you find these stories, these quote-unquote progressive stories, disgusting. If we go back to the origin, the Western civilization origin of storytelling anyways, which is based upon concepts of logic and reason, which is based upon a looking at reality and representing what you see in reality in a story, which, by the way, was done by Aristotle, the person who explained to us the first principles of logic back 2,400 years ago. When he talks about story, he talks about two different kinds of stories. He talks about comedy and tragedy. However, what we usually discuss here is drama, and drama is covered under his definition of tragedy. And this, by the way, is the pattern of storytelling that Western civilization has used for more than 2,000 years now. I would say probably more than 3,000 years now, because he was working off older stories, which again, being 2,400 years ago, he was dealing with things that happened 800 years before he was born. So here's what he says about a tragedy, again, which includes dramas. He says, a tragedy, then, is the imitation of an action that is serious and also as having magnitude, complete in itself, in language with pleasurable accessories, each kind brought in separately in the parts of the work, in a dramatic, not in a narrative form, which incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish its catharsis of such emotions. So what does he mean by all that? Well, first of all, he's discussing this according to a concept of beauty. And remember, as I talked about just a few minutes ago, of how such a man would define beauty. Beauty is an idea that goes right back to the ideas of logic and reason and the idea of the essence of a thing. What is true, and what is true is beautiful. And so when he says, a tragedy then is an imitation of an action that is serious and also as having magnitude complete in itself. Well, when he says it's serious, he means it's different from a comedy. But when he says having magnitude and complete in itself, he's talking about some of the descriptors of what is beautiful. And he later on in another chapter talks about those exact things as being what is needed for beauty. And that's why he goes on partly to say, in language with pleasurable accessories. That is to say, this imitation that you are looking at or listening to, whatever it is, this story that is in front of you, yes, it is pleasing to you in various ways, as an imitation of reality and something that is beautiful. And that's again what he means by saying each kind brought in separately in the parts of the work. That is to say, they're being brought in naturally. From one thing follows another thing. You can't put them in reverse order. They naturally flow one from the other. Once again stating a reflection of reality. He goes on to say, in a dramatic, not in a narrative form. So, basically, show, don't tell. You don't sit there and read the riot act of this is the way it is. No, if you want to do that, you're doing something other than telling a story. A story is done in a dramatic fashion. And then he goes on to the very important part saying, with incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish the catharsis of such emotions. Now this last point is important because he goes on to talk about in later chapters that this pity and fear is instilled by a horror at seeing these things. So what he's basically saying in modern terms is that you actually go to these stories because there is some horror in your life and you do internalize that to some extent, but you want to drive it out from you. You want to get rid of it. That's what a catharsis is. You want to get rid of these things, and you get rid of these things by going to read or watch a story. And in that story, you get to see these things writ large, according to their principles. Again, he goes on about that later on in the chapters, that if you're dealing with specific events, that's a history, but you're dealing with them in a more philosophical way, according to the principles of how these things exist. So that is to say, you're painting with the largest strokes imaginable if you can, and you do that so that your audience can recognize those things, feel horror and disgust, which is invoked by the pity and fear that you feel for those characters, in order for you, once again, to get rid of those horrible things that are there within you. You want to get rid of those things through this story. And by the way, a comedy is the same thing, just in a different fashion. That's why he talks about comedy as being a product of the absurd. It uses a different mechanism, but does the exact same thing. And here's the exact point of why you and I and all of us go to a story, and why we're looking at these progressive stories and saying, this is not entertainment, because it's not escapism. What is that escapism that we're talking about? It's the exact same thing that Aristotle is talking about. We wish to escape from these things through this representation of reality, which is pleasurable to us. And that escapism, in seeing these characters, in empathizing with them, in feeling pity or fear for them, we see the horror writ large in their lives. We watch it play out in front of us, and it is something that allows us to purge that from ourselves, which, by the way, is done by seeing a hero and how they, as a paragon of all the things we hold good and true, deals with these horrors himself. And we feel so much better when we actually go through this process. This pleasurable process, which involves an imitation of reality and helps us escape from reality for just a moment, where we can purge these horrible, disgusting things from our own lives so that they don't remain there. And this is exactly the opposite of what you get with a progressive story. That's why I went through all of that stuff in order to get to this point. The point of a progressive story is not to purge you of those horrible, disgusting ideas, feelings, things within your life. It's to specifically instill them within you, to make sure they don't escape from you, to make sure there is no escapism there at all for you. You must face these things because they're making you face them, because they want to drain that horror and disgust out of you as much as possible by you beginning to become numb by the constant presentation of them as if they were just another thing. And I'm here to say, never be ashamed of drawing back in fear from something. There might be a very specific and rational reason why you're doing so. Never be shamed by these people when they call you a phobe of one kind or another. If you feel some kind of disgust rising within you by what is being presented to you by these people, realize that that is exactly what they're trying to do. These quote-unquote progressive people, what they use a story for is to promote their political agenda. Their political agenda is served by people who do not have a natural disgust reaction. And so the way that they use stories is to present to you over and over something that is quite clearly disgusting, as if it were normal. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.